This is the third episode of a series, the Soil Carbon Removal Think Tank. And in this series, we bring together leading experts in the field of soil carbon removal and the voluntary carbon market, in order to together bring clarity on some of the key issues. Many of the people here today have been part of the whole journey of development of regenerative and carbon farming over the last year. And you all know, we all know that we're at the intersection of two highly complex systems. On the one hand, we have international cooperation and coordination for climate change. And on the other hand, we have agriculture with rather than against the dynamics of nature. So very exciting, at the same time, highly complex. As climate farmers, we have analyzed the space deeply over the last years. It's complex, but we have also found that there's a lot of clarity as well. So we see the incredible growth of interest in the space in the last 12, couple of more months. And what we want to do is to make the journey into the space easier and to enable a more effective growth of the regenerative agriculture space. And this is why we have set up the Soil Carbon Removal Think Tank, to make it easier for all market participants to navigate this topic. Before we begin, just a bit of housekeeping. As I said already, today's event is being recorded. The recording of the event will be uploaded to YouTube tomorrow, and it will be sent to all of you via email at the beginning of next week. Right now, your microphones are off. You're welcome to participate in the conversation by the chat. We will start off with a series of questions to our wonderful panel here, and then give space to your questions for the last 15 minutes. My dear colleague Esther will make a selection from the questions asked in the chat. Of course, what we have seen in the previous episodes of the Soil Carbon Removal Think Tank is that a lot of the conversation is really happening also in the chat. A lot of questions are being answered, so feel free to actively participate. We, of course, ask for a respectful tone in the chat throughout, and we'll monitor this. We're really looking forward to the input from everybody on the panel today, and we love to have your questions in there and your active participation. At the end of this, we will also create a blog post on key learnings from the event and share it on our LinkedIn. So make sure to follow us there. If you are interested in exploring carbon credits from Regen Ag for your company, for your organization, you can reach out to us through our website or get in touch directly with Philippe@climatefarmers.org. So with that being said, I would like to introduce you to our outstanding panel today. First of all, we have Clara Rowe, the CEO of Restor. Before joining Restor, Clara worked in supply chain sustainability in Latin America, engaging large consumer goods companies, plantation owners, and smallholder farmers in order to design and implement solutions to protect forests and respect human rights. In 2022, Clara was named a Google.org leader to watch. Welcome, Clara. And then,
thank you.
Wonderful. And then next in line is Andrea. Andrea Vera is an expert in nature-based climate projects with experience in international carbon markets and project development and implementation under different standards such as VCS, CCBS, and Gold Standard. She's the director of natural carbon solutions of FORLIANCE and the lead for the VCS biochar methodology development under Vera. Welcome, Andrea.
Thanks. Welcome, everyone.
Wonderful. And then last, but of course not least, we have Asger Olesen, is an accredited global sustainability veteran who has been investigating the triangle of land use, climate change, and markets since joining the European Commission in 2011 as LULUCF lead. Asger was most recently Technical Director, Climate Change, Ecosystem and Livelihood Services at global consultancy group, COVI, where among others, he led the 2021 study on carbon farming in the EU and provided the analytical support for the role of the land sector in Fit for 55. Welcome, Asger.
Thank you, Ivo. Great to be here.
Welcome. We're really honored to have you with us today. Really excited about the conversation. Before we get into it, though, I would like to kick us off by a few sentences of framing and background of what we are doing here. A lot of people with us today have been in the sustainability space, in the carbon market space, in the regenerative agriculture space for quite a while. Just sort of to bring it all together, I would like to say a couple of words. As probably all of us, most of us know, agriculture is a central player to each of the planetary boundaries which we have already crossed. We have the climate crisis, of course, but this is not the only thing. We have biodiversity, we have nitrogen, and a number of other areas in which agriculture plays a significant role. So we have, on the one hand, a big need to make a difference. On the other hand, we have also huge potential. To take one possible projection, the 4 per mil initiative, we could, if the global soil organic carbon content were to increase by 4 per mil annually, offset all anthropogenic climate relevant carbon emissions. This, of course, is one projection, and there's a lot of other ways to look at this, but this is just sort of to see the potential that we're talking about here, because as we all know, yes, on the one hand, we absolutely need to reduce our emissions to as close to zero as possible. But not only this, we need to go beyond only carbon zero, and we need to get to drawdown, where we pull more carbon from the atmosphere than we are adding to it. So agriculture plays very strongly into this, but it doesn't only play into this. We have a number of huge trends. We have water shortages. We have the growing appreciation for local and healthy food. We have the biodiversity crisis, as I said before. Of course, farmers are in an economic crisis. We have a whole number of areas in which regenerative agriculture can potentially play a significant role. And this is why we're talking about it today. We're seeing that not only do we have climate affecting how agriculture is developing, but also political change. So we see right now, for example, with the Ukraine war, how the dependence on politically inconsistent partners is putting our food security at risk. So we need to develop a system that's more resilient and independent if we want to maintain food security over the next decades. So the potential is there, but we have also the potential to increase, to improve the food system towards one of economic resilience, not only ecological resilience. And so the interest is huge. Now the problem is that we don't have the infrastructure for it. And so this is part of our work with climate farmers. And part of the reason why we are here today is that we want to sort of build the infrastructure, build the frameworks, bring the clarity that is needed in order to transition to regenerative methods at scale, supported by industry and policy. And the interest that we're seeing is, as today, is wonderfully there. Now, there's a lot to be said about how exactly carbon capture from agriculture works. We're not going to go into the details today, but we are going to get into the interesting questions of permanence and additionality. While we're talking a lot about carbon, this is not the only thing that is possible. This is what we're going to be focusing on today. But of course, in the future, we want to not only quantify that, but of course also look at the many co-benefits from regenerative agriculture. Carbon markets give us the potential to transition to regenerative agriculture, give us a wonderful source of financing, but of course, it is not the single silver bullet answer to this. And we need to be very careful to use the carbon markets in a responsible way in order to transition to a long-term resilient system, rather than maintaining the current system and trying to subsidize it. This is one position that I think is really important. We all know the carbon markets are unregulated. There is still a lot of Wild West going on here. And so I think one of the last points before closing that I want to make is that only scientifically sound and transparently audited methodologies should be used, as Andrea is working on right now. And more education of buyers is needed to weed out black sheep. So we need to make sure that when we buy carbon certificates, we do that responsibly, we buy from the right sources. One of the interesting developments that we have here is the planned EU regulation of voluntary carbon markets that is going to come up. Maybe it's going to figure today as well. With that as framing, really looking forward to today's conversation. From here, I would love to get into the conversation directly. So again, welcome to the wonderful panel. Welcome to everybody here today. As I said before, you're very welcome to participate in the conversation through the chat. So any questions that you have, any comments that you have, please put them in the chat. Of course, always maintaining a respectful tone and supporting each other. So now, with all of that being said, I would like to start with a question to Clara. As the CEO of Restor, you're the ideal candidate to ask this question. Could you tell us what is the additional potential that we see in restoration actually? Can you share some numbers with us?
Absolutely. Thanks so much for that great intro, Ivo. And I'm very excited to learn from Asger and Andrea and actually all of you today. There's always more to learn about carbon, is sort of how I feel about it. So you asked kind of about the potential of restoration and the additional potential of restoration. And so the first thing that we really have to do here is define what restoration is. You may be wondering, why are we talking about restoration at all in the context of regenerative agriculture or sustainable agriculture? And, you know, the Society for Ecological Restoration has defined this nice restorative continuum with reducing societal impacts on one end of that spectrum, recovering native ecosystems at the other. And at Restore, we really think about restoration as this continuum. It's many, many things, from sustainable agriculture to agroforestry, to responsible forest management, to assisted regeneration, setting land aside to regenerate naturally. So really importantly, it's multi-ecosystem and it's multi-intervention type. And in terms of the potential there, forest restoration alone, which is what has received a lot of attention and study, has the potential to improve food security for over 1 billion people through water retention to protect against drought and pest resistance from diversification, increased food productivity in some cases, use of non-timber forest products. So the list goes on. So food security, it has the potential to prevent about 60% of expected species extinctions if we're able to bring back forest ecosystems in both natural and managed forms, and to sequester about 30% of carbon that is accumulated in the atmosphere since the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. That's just forests. We still have a lot to learn about other ecosystems. And actually one of the reasons we're building Restore is to be able to accelerate learning around restoration. So huge potential there.
Wow. Did you say 60% of atmospheric carbon?
30%. So 60% of expected species extinctions. So 1 billion for people, 60% for nature, for biodiversity, and 30% carbon. Okay,
wonderful. Well, the potential is certainly there. Now, today's topic is really on two of the sort of core aspects of quality carbon certification, which is permanence on the one side and additionality on the other side. And so I would like to ask Asger, I know you have an interesting opinion on this. As an expert on the public climate finance debate, why are permanence and additionality such important criteria? Why are they talked about so much?
Thanks, Ivo, and thank you also, Clara, for that good introduction. Yes, indeed, permanence and additionality have been some key concepts that remain to be in just about any robust methodology out there for the voluntary carbon market, but I should say also for projects. And I assume here that we're talking about climate projects in the land sector, because that has indeed something to say here. I think in particular in an EU context, if we just start there, then we need to look at the context of climate projects in the land sector in the last 10 years or so, because such projects has been implemented in a setting where we talked about emission reductions, incremental emission reductions. So getting from one level of emissions to another level of emissions, reducing, that's an incremental. That is, so you need to know where you come from and where you go to and what would have happened without. But we've also been working in a sector without a target. So there has been no official, let's say, baseline, not even a country level over those past 10, 15 years in the EU. There's been no target for the land sector, so nothing to compare to. You've also worked in a sector where there's been no effective pricing of emissions or removals. So there has now been no de facto incentive to do good or bad. And then also we've been working on a project level in a sea of inaction. So there's been this discrete projects here and there. So obviously, if you are investing in a project using public climate finance, but just also private finance, that should reduce, is in contact with our target, there's no price signal, and is the only one in the area, then you would perceive that as being quite a risky investment, where you would like to be sure that you get money for what you pay for, the additionality, and that it remains so. That's the permanence part. But let's just, again, from a slightly philosophical point of view, and I'll come back to that maybe later, try to compare this a short while with the emission trading scheme of the EU. Here, permanence and additionality is not an issue. Maybe it should be, but it's not an issue because of the system design. An entity can reduce its emissions next year, but it can just as much choose to increase its emissions next year and then just pay the penalty. So that's basically pricing. And that's, from the atmosphere's point of view, breaching permanence. It has no difference from an atmospheric CO2 level point of view, whether it's a land manager breaching permanence or whether it's a smokestack emitting more from an energy plant. And likewise, additionality in the ETS, that's not so much a problem because they all have a reduction target. So if you go beyond that, you have allowances to trade. And if you do less, you need to go buy. That's your baseline. And you need nothing more than that baseline. So that's just as much to say that maybe the problem on permanence additionality, at least in an EU context, is that we don't have a target. There is no price signal, and not everyone is included. And I'll come back to that a little later, maybe because we continue to talk about incremental reductions instead of obtaining and maintaining a balance on an annual basis. So yes, permanence and additionality are indeed very important, but because of the setting, and it's the setting and the system we need to change here, not necessarily the methodologies.
That's a great framing of it. We're looking at how the whole system is set up and why sort of those criteria are important within the larger system design.
Exactly.
Thank you. Andrea, I know that FORLIANCE has been working on transparent and high quality carbon projects from nature-based solutions for a long time. How do you take permanence and additionality into account, and why do they matter according to you in the private carbon market?
Sure, thanks, Ivo. Yeah, I would like to reply that question mainly from two perspectives. One from our project developer perspective, because from this perspective, we must be sure that the impact is real, meaning actually that the emission reductions and removals from the project activity, either reforestation, agroforestry, or forest conservation, for example, are additional to the scenario without project implementation. Why is that? Because other way, we will be financing an activity that will have taken place either way without the need of carbon finance. And therefore, we will be adding more emissions or tons of CO2 to the atmosphere instead of actually reducing it. On the other side, about permanence, we must account emissions or removals for a long term. And in this sense, permanence means that carbon, once removed, cannot be or should not be at least emitted back into the atmosphere. Usually, permanence from a project developer perspective is linked to the risk of reversal of those emissions reduced or removed. For example, if we are talking about nature-based projects, risk to the carbon could be to the carbon storage could be forest fires, diseases, for example, illegal logging as well. So every carbon project that we develop must have a comprehensive risk mitigation in place, and especially because prevention should be part of the project activities. In the case there is an event of reversal of the emissions already reduced or removed, for example, we can also, let's say, mitigate the carbon losses, taking carbon credits or emission reduced from a buffer pool. A buffer pool is where a percentage of the project emissions reductions are stored, usually in the folio sector, as we call it, agroforestry, forestry, and other land uses located, and therefore we can not issue with a 100% of the potential carbon credit of a project, but only a percentage of the carbon sequestered. Now talking a little bit more on the I will say carbon markets perspective, usually from a buyer perspective. I will say the buyer of carbon credits, either for offsetting or neutralization purposes, for example, they really trust on the environmental integrity and robustness of the standards. Corporates at different scales of different sectors that are pledging the climate commitments, they need to reduce and then they will compensate, right? But sorry, I got an echo. But we see on the voluntary carbon markets that there are different corporates with different financial power to invest in understanding exactly what is the type of project activity that they would like to, to finance or to buy carbon credits from. We see, for example, big corporates like Microsoft or Shopify, where they have the financial power to have a unit, for example, dedicated to understand what is additionality, what is permanence, what type of projects do they want. But there is also other corporates with not so much knowledge about the carbon market or the voluntary carbon markets, and therefore they rely on the accredited standards and trust on that all the carbon emissions or carbon removal, for example, is real, permanent, additional, and measurable.
Wonderful, thank you. So there are sort of these specific systems in order to make sure that we have additionality and permanence into account. If we now go, before we sort of go back to some of the points that were addressed at the beginning, if we go a bit more sort of into the details and sort of in how it works in practice. Clara, I know that Restor is working a lot on sort of context appropriate and restoration. So to ask a provocative question, if our goal is carbon uptake by nature, wouldn't it make most sense to take the plants that are most efficient at carbon uptake and just plant as many as possible of them?
Love the question. You've just perfectly set me up for a one-word answer, which is no. Resounding no. Which, yeah, I know, shocking, which I think that we can all relate to, right? And when I gave the framing about what restoration has the potential to do, you'll note that I started with people, I talked about biodiversity, and I talked about climate. And of course, embedded within those three things, there are other ecosystem services like water retention and local cooling effects and medicinal value of plants and, preventing coastal erosion and flooding and global pandemic prevention, something that's really on our mind these days. So, you could go on and on and on about the list of those things. And that means as we think about restoration, we have to think about all of this in an intertwined way. So carbon is one of many services that are provided by natural or modified ecosystems. And the way that I've been thinking about it lately is carbon is a co-benefit of nature restoration rather than biodiversity or people being the co-benefits associated with carbon sequestration. If we only think about carbon, and again, this is obvious, but we're missing a huge part of the story, and we can end up doing more harm than good. Some of you might remember the forest fires in Portugal from 2017, 8 days in the municipality of Pedrógão Grande, killed about 66 people and injured more than 200. And, of course, it's hard to attribute a single cause to a particular fire. But in this case, we saw a combination of extensive eucalyptus plantation, a non-native plant there, and an early heat wave, and a lightning strike just lit that up. And so what we can really learn from that is nature-based projects from a unidimensional perspective are really damaging. We need to be thinking about the bigger picture here. And I guess just the last point, and then I'll pass it on, is that if we think about nature-based solutions only in the context of carbon, we also put ourselves at the risk of devaluing ecosystems if we find cheaper ways to sequester carbon, right? And I don't know if that will happen anytime soon. I don't think that we're in the position of that happening incredibly quickly, but we don't want to be in the position where suddenly we don't value ecosystems for all of the other things that they do and cannot direct financial flows to them.
I really love the framing of sort of carbon is almost a co-benefit of ecosystem restoration rather than it being the other way around. I think what is so interesting about this is the fact that we're talking about natural ecosystems, we're talking about complex systems, we're not talking about mechanical systems, right? And this is the big difference there if we're talking about direct air capture, for example, versus ecosystem restoration or regenerative agriculture, that both of them have tremendous potential, but we need to approach them differently. In the case of ecosystems, we cannot say, okay, carbon, and therefore, we just focus on carbon, because sometimes this is going to have the opposite effect, as for example, in the case of Portugal, lots of trees planted lead to lots of trees burning. Rather, we sort of need to go around it in order to get to the actual target. I really love that framing. Thank you. If we just look at the very concrete case, because now we're sort of looking at the sort of the big concepts, but I would just like to zoom in maybe one case, Andrea, in practice. Like when we're talking about additionality, it often seems like it basically means, well, that project would not have happened without, right? That sounds simple. How does it work in practice?
So we, for example, nature-based project for implementation of a carbon certification, we also follow like different steps. I mean, the first is also an initial screening, where we at first also need to consider the previous consideration of carbon finance. So I will say like this is the step 0 of additionality in a long way. Just exactly for what you mentioned, Ivo, and I was mentioning before, that the project needs to be implemented in an additional way. The second step also that we consider is, for example, the retroactivity of the project, meaning that the project could have started in the past, meaning that, for example, not 2022, but probably 2019, but cannot continue without the carbon finance for the project implementations or for monitoring purposes, for example. But in this case, we also need to consider that when we talk about retroactivity, we are also mentioning a retroactivity of 3 to 5 years maximum, depending on the standard that we will be using. Because again, if it's not additional, the project will be financing a common practice that has been continuing from the last 10 years and is not really additional activity to what is happening on the past. Then we need to also check right now after what are actually the project activities that is related to the second step that I was mentioning, and how the existence of this voluntary carbon market is going to overcome different barriers that will prevent an activity moving forward in the absence of this additional finance, right? So barriers could be also in the case of financial, economically viable without carbon finance, for example, but can also be technological, maybe lack of knowledge or a know-how on how to actually make more sustainable or a more climate friendly, I could say, like different activities. Or it could also be institutional, right? Maybe there is an opposition of a certain technology in a country. There are like different barriers. Fourth point that we also consider, right, talking about additionality, is a bit linked to what Clara was describing before, because we also need to look additionality in terms of co-benefits. We assess the project as well, like what is the impact that is actually having on the ground? What are the additional co-benefits of setting an agroforestry project, a reforestation project, in terms of the social and the biodiversity component? So for example, in the case of gold standard, that is one of the carbon standards, they require that a project, any project should comply with at least or should achieve at least 3 SDGs. So right, we are not just talking about just carbon sequestration, but also potentially other activities like training, education, biodiversity conservation, and so on. The last point that we also see on additionality when we assess a different project is on terms of the country policy and the national determined contributions. So we also need to check from a legal view if the project activities and the emission reductions generated by this new potential project, for example, are additional and not derived from the mandatory law or legislation in this case.
So basically, there's a lot of different areas that we look at when we talk about additionality, and that we, for example, in our work with farmers, we go through sort of the different barriers that would hinder the uptake of certain agricultural practices, and then sort of look at would this be eligible within our methodology? Absolutely, yeah.
Yes.
If we now look at sort of from the practical perspective onto some of the challenges around additionality and permanence, one thing I would like to get into, the other day I just saw a really great piece by the New York Times, I think, on peatlands in Congo and the preservation of peatlands in Congo, and basically the question, well, we want the farmers in this area in Congo to preserve those peatlands, but who is going to pay for that, right? Who is going to so we have that interest, but how is this going to make sense for them? We have that same question generally in agriculture, right? Like we are sort of disincentivizing pioneers. Farmers that have done a great job in capturing carbon over a period of time are somewhat disincentivized by that argument of additionality. And so I would like to sort of put the question into the room, that how can we finance preservation? Are there dynamics, are there processes, are there ways in the carbon markets that have worked, for example, preserving pristine rainforests, for example, peatlands like this, that will allow us to finance the preservation of carbon in the ground or in nature-based solutions? Chris, if anybody would like to pick up that question.
Yeah, I can pick up on that one, Ivo, because I think that's a very key question here also to ask. And in fact, I think the carbon market as it's been designed, and I totally agree with Clara here, and that's also the FSC's point of view, that carbon is only a small part of it. But the way carbon markets has been designed level is to again achieve emission reductions or additional removals in as short as time possible. So that will naturally generate a favorism for the projects with high carbon flux density. And that means that creating projects that do not change the flux significantly needs to be, it's more difficult to design those. And in particular, then the project category we've seen over the past 15 years developing out of REDD+, among other, for avoided emissions, avoided deforestation, where basically you try to price something that doesn't happen. Now, the problem is in that is, as I see it, again, this inherited focus on incremental change, because that's not true payment for ecosystem services. I mean, the whole service provided of that forest, whether it changes or not, has a value for society. So one of the ways I think, and I know these conversations are going on, one of the things we could change, in particular the EU system design to respect this, is to say that what we value, what we price, that's the full emission negatively, that's a cost, and the full removal, not the change from one euro to the other. Because in that way, we make a business case for protecting nature, not just carbon optimizing nature. And if we change that basically pretty fundamental metric, then we can also much easier govern and create incentives for climate neutrality and even climate positive. in all sorts of counterfactual units floating around in the system, where we calculate averages over 5 years or even more, as we've done in EU climate policy over the past 25 years. It should be an annual snapshot. Every year you need to have balance or positive. And to do that, then matching actual emissions with actual removals would make a lot of sense and would be easier to govern. And that would also, as said, create the incentive for conservation, protection forests, and make it easier to do peatland rewetting projects that currently will, they have a lot of carbon, they have huge fluxes, but the change is small every year. And in particular, if you do your rewetting, you will have pulses of methane and other stuff that make, in many cases, there is no good business case onto the current carbon markets. So I think that's one of the things we need to do also, because that will align much easier with a lot of the other ecosystems. In an ecosystem, it's not about paying whether there's 5 bees more the year after. It's, do you have a safe and sound bee population that pollinate the flowers? Yes, then that has a value.
Mm-hmm. 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 So there's a lot of potential to still sort of add to the system. I'm going to come back to that later on sort of the design of the system. One thing I would like to ask probably Clara and Andrea on is when we're talking about permanence in nature-based solution, I think maybe the term is also not ideal, because in nature-based solutions we don't really have that, right? Like we can ensure sort of longevity, but it's very hard to ensure permanence. What are your experiences on the aspect of economic development? I think, Clara, you addressed that sort of community restoration is the first aspect. What is your experience on sort of taking into account economic restoration, economic regeneration for communities in order to improve the longevity of nature-based solutions? Maybe Clara, would you like to start?
Sure, absolutely. And I should say, I think my connection is going in and out. So if you lose me, shout, and I'll repeat what I was just saying. But, you know, again, I think you're setting me up to give the obvious answers. It's completely critical for the longevity of nature restoration and conservation projects for them to have an economic viability for communities. And we can really only scale restoration and maintain conservation if there are economically viable options for communities around the world. There's a lot of ways to do this, you know, and this goes back to Asger's point around incentivizing conservation. And we need to come up with more ways to do that, but there are government programs like Payment for Ecosystem Services, not as many as there need to be, and not always structured in the perfect ways, but those do exist. There are government subsidies for sustainable agriculture, or we could just stop subsidizing conventional agriculture in many cases. You know, there are sustainable development grants. There are carbon payments that can be done well and that can be done more poorly. And then there's, you know, demand for sustainable products more broadly, right? Demand for sustainable timber, demand for agricultural products that do take care of the land, that do take care of biodiversity. So there's all of these different ways that we can make restoration economically viable if we build that in to the way that we're thinking about compensation, essentially, for work that's happening. There's a lot of research that areas and restoration projects will benefit. Thousands of projects on Restore today, almost all of them cite financing as their major need. And yes, there are other needs, but that is always there. It is always central to our ability to do restoration and conservation long term.
Thank you. So such an important element to take into account in order to make sure that the project stays. Andrea, can you talk about sort of how is this done in practice in the work that you're doing, and can you talk about how that is done?
Mm-hmm. Yes, sure. I mean, I was just also thinking something that just to complement a little bit on the question before about financing, because this is also the main objective or the key objectives of the carbon project and carbon finance, to give value to restoring the natural capital, so it's more profitable, for example, or more economically viable to develop a nature-based project in comparisons to any other no climate friendly project. So carbon credits are usually the incentive for the project developers and the communities involved in these projects to conserve the standing forest, like on Red Plus project, for example, or a restoration project as well. And when, from our perspective, for example, when a project through carbon finance, a project is implemented with a strong and fair revenue sharing mechanisms, is the instrument to actually project development and to finance the conservation of ecosystem, for example. So I just also want to highlight a little bit that I agree that carbon finance is the vehicle to achieve a sustainable agricultural project or agroforestry or forestry, for example. But in the end, is not on the long term, right? We need to create capacities or build, I don't know, like training or share knowledge in order for the communities, for example, or the farmers on the long term, they are not dependent of this revenue or the income from the carbon finance. So on practice, how we do it, a little bit now shifting to the second question. So usually the nature-based projects and their gold standard or VCS standard, for example, are set up in a creating period of 30 years. Yeah, so that means that during 30 years, they are going to receive different revenues that come from the from the sales of the carbon credits. Yeah, but specifically on permanence, for example, as mentioned, it's not that they are going to receive like 100% of the carbon credits, because just a percentage will be stored in a buffer pool. So at the end of the 30 years creating period, like these emission reductions that the project has achieved during the long term of the 30 years, is still there on the buffer pool, and at the end of the creating period is cancelled. That means that the buffer or the emission reductions during these 30 years will remain probably on the standard, and that will assure that on the next year, for example, after the project is not longer under VCS or gold standard, the actual emission reductions are continuing in case, for example, there is a risk of reversal or something happened with the carbon stocks, for example. So I think on a practical way, as a project developers, they are ways that we can also make sure at least that that permanence on nature-based projects working together with the standards is achieved, right? So it's just looking more on a practical and implementator way, in this case from us. And I will say that also we rely a lot on the standards for this, for especially permanence, for how do they set up the risk, how to calculate it, what is the minimum, how much percentage of the risk of the project needs to go into this buffer pool. Every project is different. Some projects just have, for example, 10% of the total amount of carbon credits going into the buffer pool. Other ones with higher risk will be like 20, 25%. So it's also really project specific. But I think that what the standards are doing, from my perspective as well, is like having this buffer pool that allows at least ensure some permanence on the long term.
Yeah, when we're working with farmers, it's really so much about understanding how the system makes sense on the long term, how we sort of have a more resilient, both ecological but very strongly also economic system. So the continuation of the regeneration practices makes sense after the period of the financing is over, and this seems to be really key in order to ensure longevity of not only the carbon but also the biodiversity, water, etc. Gains that we want to see. Yeah. When sort of going into maybe sort of the last questions, and then to leave space for participant questions. I'm curious, Asger, you sort of addressed the current system design. How could we approach this system differently in order to make it maybe more effective than what it is right now?
Thanks, Ivo. Yes, I think we all know and understand, and I think there's been very good accounts here by Clara and Andrea also on how complicated in reality it is to create and develop good additional projects with permanence that have a good business case that respects all the rights and enhance all other ecosystem services than just the climate part. But one of the reasons why that is difficult is because there is no system to support it, as I alluded to earlier on. So I think this situation will largely continue until 2030 in the EU, but 2030 is also, let's say, a cutoff date. It can become a year of transition if we make sure that after 2030, the system in place for Fit for 55 is designing away to the extent possible some of those difficulties. And I do think we can do that. I mean, first of all, on additionality, imagine if we had a system where every land manager, every plot of land in the EU, no matter its use, had a target on it on either maintain or improve by a certain amount. It can be designed in different ways, to a certain level. Not only carbon fluxes and storage, but also a number of other nature benchmarks, ecosystem services. That would basically make additionality much less of an issue, because then you had, if you go beyond that, you can deliver to the rest anything that can be validated and third-party verified, if you go beyond what is expected. On permanence, if we had a clear price signal, again at this level, at the plot level, at the farm level, for all fluxes, but also a number of the priceable other ecosystem services, then if you do good, there is a business case in it. If you choose for various reasons to deteriorate the environment on your land for whatever purpose, maybe to produce more, then that will cost, because any emission, any degradation will take away income for you. So that would, to some extent, address permanence. In particular, if connected to, and that's another part, the pricing, as I said before, of the full ecosystem service and not the change. Then you will be punished if you do bad, and you will thrive if you do good, basically. And then thirdly, if this was applied, as I said, land wall to wall across the EU for all land uses, then all parts of intra-EU leakage would be reduced. You could still then obviously have leakage in and out of the EU, but essentially you wouldn't be able to move emissions to a place where they were not at a cost, or move environmental degradation to a place where they would not be catched up, be caught and be priced. So there are some simple design principles for an EU system that, of course, will take a lot of discussion to implement, but I think we should look at that. We should demand that from a future EU setup, and perhaps even beyond. That's the way to put the true value on forests. But then, obviously, the issues in and out of EU remains. But I think much more important for this discussion in the future on the system is what world do we foresee in terms of all the non-carbon benefits, which I think is a bit of a bluff to talk about. It's like, as Clara said, it's all of them. Currently, we price carbon, and that creates a bit of a distortion in terms of incentives. But how do we foresee that we would have one nature unit that represents sound nature at the one extreme, or basically ability to price whatever you want and whatever you want, where you want, whatever ecosystem service you want to focus on? I don't think that's a good scenario either. So that's the discussion I think we should be having, instead of too much focus on some design features of the system that can be addressed.
Fascinating. Thank you very much, Chris. I think it would be great to go into some of the participants' questions, and there's two questions that go in the direction of the voluntary carbon markets in combination with public regulation and funding. So Stefan, who joined us last time on the panel, welcome back, Stefan, asked, how do the speakers view the growing prevalence of government subsidies, incentives for regenerative practices that could exceed expected revenues from carbon finance with respect to the question of additionality? And later we have a similar question on regulation that I'm just going to add here from Wiebke. Does anyone know of states or countries, I guess, who already count soil carbon into national carbon accounts, making it unfit for voluntary carbon markets, like the rest of, like in Germany, for example, with forest carbon sequestration? Or do you know if there's similar regulation coming up? She sees this as one of the major regulatory risks for voluntary carbon markets because it destroys private incentives. So on the one hand, we have regulation, and on the other hand, we have financing. What are your thoughts on that?
I can just briefly mention here that together with one of the other participants in the workshop today, I had the privilege of supporting a publication in Nature earlier this year on going through the soil carbon inventories of all EU member states, and that is alarming reading. There's basically no one having calibrated models, and far fewer member states, I think it's less than 10%, that essentially are able to calculate and account for the carbon in their soils. So this is certainly something we need to move on, and needs to be much more of a priority, just given the size of the carbon, the soil carbon stock. But again, that's only EU. Globally, it's looking even worse in some parts for good reasons. So we need to invest in soil carbon data. Yes.
I'm just thinking also a little bit on the questions on subsidies as well. I mean, a little bit talking from my experience with forest conservation and also some payment for ecosystem services on some incentive, for example, from some countries. I think we could also need to understand like how long are the incentives from a government going to be, right? Sometimes it's just like about a short period, like 3 years, because they just want to make changes regarding to, I don't know, the government period that they are in, for example, as we experience in some of our forestry projects as well. But then again, the potential forestry farmers, for example, they were left again in zero when they change policies. So I think just talking a little bit from a tropical perspective, what we also need to do, or what I think also need to do, for example, is strengthening also our governance regarding also like incentive, if there is going to be a policy to be on the long term, because I think that's the difference when we talk with the carbon finance, that we know that the farmer is going to commit maybe from a 5, 10, 30 years period, and the project will run through all these 30 years and will, in theory, and in practice as well, it should not stop due to different change of, for example, in policy things. So, I mean, at least what we saw on different projects is like, okay, we can take part of the incentive, for example, at least from the forestry case, of implement or planting some of the trees, but then the carbon finance also come for the monitoring on the long term, right? Now we are also talking about forest inventory, conventional way, go to the, for example, to the field and measure tree and height, but now we also have some tools like remote sensing, right, that can also support us. But also, yeah, they also cost or getting access. So carbon finance can also be the way into make sure of the permanence or the longevity of the carbon stock or carbon storage is there.
Wonderful. Okay, I'm curious of going towards sort of the one of the questions that I really would like to ask all of you, and also still giving space to further questions from participants. But first of all, so from what we have talked about today, and I know that quite a number of the participants today are funders in different ways, are participants in the carbon markets as buyers. What would you recommend to them to look out for? How would you recommend investing in climate protection, in restoration, in the different elements that we have talked about? What would you say to look out for? Maybe Clara, would you like to start?
Yeah, and I can keep it super short. I would say for me, the number one thing is think holistically. So if it seems simple, if it seems like a silver bullet, there's probably something missing. It's not that we can't reduce complexity, we can, but we need to be thinking holistically in this space.
And is there something, like, how do I know that it is the right thing? That is, it can be complex and probably still not be the right thing to invest in. What would you look out for?
So I guess big picture, I'd look out for those pillars of people and climate and biodiversity, and ensure that projects are thinking about each aspect of that and taking into account what's happening, not just from a carbon sequestration perspective, but from those other pillars as well.
Really look at also quantifying co-benefits, quantifying the other elements, community, ecosystem, etc.
Exactly. I tried to avoid that word, but
sorry. Andrea, please.
Yeah, no, sorry. I mean, I think that's something that I really like about the standards, and I'm so sorry if I'm so much into the standards from a project implementation way, because those are the guidelines on especially how to assess a project from also from an investor perspective, also from a technical way, because I agree with Clara when she said we need to focus also on the social or on the people, and specifically the standard. For example, the climate community and biodiversity standard say, okay, we need to do the local stakeholder consultations. You need to prove that the communities wants to be involved. I mean, if there is an investor that wants to invest in a project and there is no security that the community will participate, then we know the project potentially will fail. And as the same probably with biodiversity, what is the baseline? What are we talking when we say the project activity is going to support the communities? What are the indicators? How can we monitor this? So I think also having this guideline from Vera, for example, or from Gold Standard, also thinking not only on the carbon part, but also giving guidelines on how to assess the project from a community perspective, on involvement, on participation, free, prior, and informed consent, for example, that needs to be always done, but also from a biodiversity, that we are not just talking about finance monocultures, for example, right? But we also are thinking more in a landscape approach where it can deliver more co-benefits, as mentioned before.
Really looking at community, sort of the inclusion of community into the project design from the beginning. I think that's a great one. Asger, what would you say?
I can only mirror and support what has been said so far. So for me, I think adding to that, if it's another perspective, then it would be that we really need to fix the find a solution to how to include all the smallholders, all the community and family landowners around there, because the carbon market and all the investors that are in my inbox saying, hey, SFSC, don't you know a great forest where I can just optimize carbon and then I can sell the credits? Say, no, I'm not going to work with you on that. That's not how we address these problems. 2/3 of all forests in the world, and that's just because what I represent, are one way or the other stewarded, custodied, or managed by smallholders, communities, family forests, and indigenous peoples. And as long as the market and investors continue to look for big ticket size bonds with several millions in them that needs to protect an area the size of Sicily, then a lot of this other potential will never get out there and have impact and make sure that they're part of the solution. So I'd say coming up with financial instrument to make sure we have fair income distribution and can include smallholders and all the variants into this, that's the challenge. And that's what I'm saying to all investors. You need to fix that if you want to work with us.
I think those are All of those are such great points. I think on the one hand, really looking at the holistic ecosystem and social aspects of carbon projects, not focus only on carbon. One of the reasons why we avoid the word carbon farming for regenerative agriculture, because it sort of creates that single focus. And on the other hand, making sure that we include smallholders and not sort of just these very, on the one hand, very scalable, but probably not very holistic approaches. And I think this is really the challenge of everything we're doing, right? Or to combine sort of these very global perspectives and very large investment approaches with the very, very context specific situation that we have in restoration, that we have in regeneration, and that we really have no way of going around that if we actually want to have long-term change. So this is very much in line also with what Climate Farmers is working on building that infrastructure to channel the information and the financing. I want to say thank you, everybody. Thank you very much, Andrea, Clara, Asger. Thank you very much for participating. That was a great conversation. I want to repeat again, the recording of this conversation is going to be shared with everybody via email. It's going to be uploaded on our YouTube channel, but you will get it into your inbox probably by next week. We are going to have a monthly further editions of this think tank to explore other elements of the carbon markets. And we're really looking forward to the ongoing conversation. Really hope to welcome you all again. Thank you so much.